Hei kjære lytter, og tusen takk for at du hører på Henrik Beckheim podcast. Denne podden folkefinansiert, og om du har lyst til å støtte arbeidet med denne podden videre, så kan du vippse et valgfritt beløp til Vippsnummer 82 32 78. Jeg setter stor pris på enhver støtte du har lyst til å gi. Tusen takk. Denne episoden sponset av Kristent Ressurssenter. De jobber med kulturendring ved å løfte fram tradisjonell kristen virkelighetsforståelse på familie, kjønn, sex og identitet inn i den norske samfunnsdebatten. Truls Olufsen Meus, som var på podcasten min her for en liten stund siden, på kort tid blitt til landets mest kjente kristne samfunnsdebattant, og han skapte nasjonale overskrifter fra podcasten her da han kalte Pressens hus for en rottebolig. Hør gjerne på den episoden med Truls og bli kjent med Kristent Ressurssenter sitt arbeid på kressurs.no. Truls har 15 000 følgere på Facebook, så ta en kikk på hva han driver med rundt dette med å sette kjønn på dagsorden. Sjekk ut nettsidene deres ved å klikke på lenken i beskrivelsen under her, eller gå til kressurs.no. Jonathan, welcome to Norway and thanks for being here in the studio with me.
Thank you for having me, Henrik. A pleasure.
My pleasure too. We've been talking a bit during the weekend. You've been here for the Nordic Israel Congress, and I've had the pleasure to hear you speak as well about the subjects of Israel and Gaza and everything that's going on. So it's been really interesting to listen to you.
Thank you.
Also, first and foremost, I want to also extend my deepest condolences to the Israeli people and to the Jewish people for the atrocities of the 7th of October, and also remind everybody that there are still hostages sitting in Gaza area.
Yes, 132 of them.
Yeah, my thoughts go out to them and to the families who are still missing their loved ones.
Yes, and who have been going through hell for almost 7 months. I think more and more signs of frustration are shown now in Israeli society. The families are growing more and more impatient with the government, demanding more action and most importantly, results. And you can really see how Hamas is using this and manipulating it and extracting every piece or every drop of poison that they can from this horrible situation that they have created, from taking Israelis hostages, women and children in their pajamas from their beds, from their homes, and also men and also soldiers. But civilians and officers and soldiers, some of them dead, some of them alive. It's an extremely cruel situation that I don't think that any other country has faced such a horrible, traumatic experience. Definitely not in these numbers. And Israel is dealing with that in parallel to fighting a war on, currently it's 4 fronts. It may expand to more fronts than that, but currently we are fighting actively on 4 fronts. And when you take into consideration all of the things that Israel is doing and the amount of pressure that Israel is under, military, diplomatic, emotional, still reeling from trauma and the horrible disaster of October the 7th, I am very proud of Israelis. I'm proud of civil society. I'm proud of the IDF, and I'm proud of some of the decisions that the Israeli government has taken. But Israel as a whole, I think, is holding up to a lot of pressure. For those people who support freedom and democracy around the world, they should be siding with Israel, supporting Israel, and actually applauding Israel for its ability to continue to stand tall against all of these very dark forces.
Yeah. Also, do you think that the Israeli government is doing enough to get the hostages out? Is it doing everything it can? Because I know that a lot of the families, I've seen them demonstrating, and they are, of course, upset that they are not released yet. Do you find it strange that they haven't been able to release them yet, to get them out? Or is this, it's of course a difficult situation, but...
Yeah, it's a very difficult situation, but the short answer to the first question, whether enough is being done, I think is no. A lot is being done. Security forces have risked their lives and have tried to get hostages out. Israel has been was successful in getting 3 Israelis out, 2 older men and 1 woman, the woman and the soldier in the first few weeks of the war, and then a few months ago in Rafah, 2 Israeli hostages were released, but other than that, sadly not. And we understand that what Hamas are doing is using the hostages in order to delay future activities of Israel and in order to basically delay an Israeli victory. And it's a terrible dilemma for Israeli decision makers. But I can tell you that I anticipated that Israel would be able to get Israelis out faster, not through negotiations. I was pleasantly surprised and extremely happy for the families of 124 Israelis that have been brought home and reunited with their families. By the way, many of these women telling stories of horrible terror and torture, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, extremely harsh conditions, horrible experiences that I'm sure it will take them, hopefully not their entire lives to get free of, but many of them will be scarred for life. So I was very happy to see those Israelis rescued and released. And I am, I should say, disappointed with the fact that we haven't gotten more Israelis out. You know, when you zoom out and you look at the events that have transpired since October 7, what eventually I think will stay in Israeli collective memory, one is the military, intelligence, and government failure that led to and that happened on October the 7th. That's one major issue that will be in Israeli collective psyche for a long, long time. And it will be investigated and it will be fixed and improved on the military level. The government level, I don't know how much will be improved, but I'm sure that on the military level, things will look different. Another wound that is still open, and I think it will take the longest time to heal, and once it heals, it will leave the ugliest scar, is the issue of the hostages. And like many things, sadly, it's being leveraged politically, and it's being used as a political tool in Israeli politics and in global politics, US-Israeli relations. This has been kind of a friction point, and these poor hostages and their suffering families have been part of a tug of war and tussle between different governments, which I think is very, very sad and unfortunate. And bottom line, some people appear to have forgotten that we're dealing with a very cruel terrorist organization that has absolutely no morals and that are doing everything that they can in order to squeeze and extract pain and suffering and political leverage by having these hostages. So what I hope will happen is that when now hopefully Israel goes into Rafah and attacks Hamas in Rafah, not the civilian population, gets the civilians out, but attacks Hamas in Rafah and does it in a very strong and kinetic, which is nice words for using lots of firepower, which is what Israel will do, but goes in, does it and does it right, like it's supposed to be done, and then goes in and finds the hostages and prioritizes going for the hostages. Even if it means that there will be rescue attempts that will be costly in lives and difficult, which they will be, I think that this should be the priority. And hopefully some of these operations will lead to successful rescued Israeli hostages.
What's it like, you think, for an IDF soldier on the ground? You have extensive experience as a soldier yourself. Was it like over 20 years as a soldier on the ground? And also you're a former IDF spokesperson. What do you think it's like for the IDF soldiers there on the ground now? And also, side question, how are they able, do they have any techniques to be able to differentiate between real civilians who mean no harm, like the real civilians, and the actual like Hamas dressed as civilians? How do they differentiate?
Yeah, those are two really good questions. And I'm sure that many people, I don't know, your listeners, they're probably above average when it comes to the analysis of the situation. But I'm sure that many people in Norway and around the world, they don't think of Israeli soldiers as humans, perhaps. They see a green mass, right? And they think perhaps of very powerful soldiers and a strong military, and they have all kinds of ideas in their head. But, many of the soldiers, they're either 18, 19, or 20-year-old young adults, or some of them are people with families. All of the reserve soldiers, they are, in their late 20s, early 30s, and sometimes 40s. They are men with families who leave everything behind, and they are summoned to come to fight. They, of course, respond quickly and present themselves for duty, and they go and fight, risking their lives and risking, their safety and families, etc. Having been on the ground in similar conditions and having fought in Gaza for over almost 5 years, not at the intensity that we're seeing now, especially not the type of intensity in Gaza City and some of the fights in Khan Yunis. It's a very challenging environment. The biggest there's many things that are challenging in war. There's fear, there's pressure, there's physical discomfort, there's danger, there's fatigue, there's hunger, again, fear. But one thing that makes it so difficult for a soldier to do his job well is the uncertainty and the fluidity in the quickly changing situation on the ground. And it relates to your second question of how do you distinguish between who is an enemy and a threat and who isn't? And Israeli soldiers, contrary to how the IDF is being portrayed in international media mostly, and by a lot of people who either hate Israel or are ignorant or don't care to look at the facts, Israeli soldiers are very careful not to hit civilians. And they are trying as hard as they can in a very dynamic situation to use deadly force against the enemy and, as far as possible, not to hurt civilians. Now, the situation is almost impossible because what Hamas has done over the years and over these almost 7 months of fighting is that they use everything that is part of the civilian structures in Gaza. They use it for military purposes. So it may look civilian, it may sound civilian, it may be in a civilian location, but it's not civilian. I'll give you an example. When you look at Hamas videos, combat videos that they present on social media showing their battle success, what you see are young guys in civilian clothes with a vest on or without a vest, running around with RPGs and Kalashnikovs and IEDs and explosives, running around in civilian areas, in civilian houses in Gaza, fighting against Israeli troops. And then when they're killed, and this Hamas doesn't show on their videos, but when they're killed, they are in civilian clothes. Their friends, they take off the vest from them, and this guy looks like a civilian that was just killed by Israeli forces. Poor him. And we've had multiple reports of Israeli soldiers who say that they were, for instance, in a position and they were approached by women and children with white flags, approaching and asking for food or asking for water. And then when Israeli soldiers go out of protected positions and in order to help them, a sniper shoots and kills. And, it's maybe the viewers and listeners, they don't know how pervasive, how deep this goes in Gaza. Without being too shallow, what I would say is that all of the infrastructure in Gaza has been enslaved by Hamas for their military purposes. There's nothing that is purely 100% civilian. Churches, mosques, hospitals, schools, UN facilities. All of these, and I can give many examples of each and every category, have been used in Gaza by Hamas in order to fight from. Every single hospital, the Qatari one, the Al-Shifa hospital, the Indonesian, the Turkish, whichever hospital, and by the way, Gaza had more than 40 hospitals, which I think is even more than the amount of hospitals in Norway. Per 1,000 citizens, Gaza had more than that. It definitely had more than what Israel has. I was surprised to see how many hospitals they have. But all of these hospitals were used by Hamas to fight from, which is a war crime. You're not supposed to use hospitals to fight from. You're not supposed to dig tunnels underneath schools. You're not supposed to dig tunnels or to fight from UN compounds. And you're not supposed to use mosques to fire rockets from or to fire at Israeli forces from. All of these things are crimes that Hamas has done on the battlefield. They have been documented by Israel. But then when Israel goes to show it and tries to tell the world, listen, this is the reality that we're facing, that gets stuck somewhere in some kind of editorial or journalistic filter, and that story isn't told. And in fact, that story needs to be told because that is a key part in understanding why there's so much destruction in Gaza and why there are so many, sadly, casualties that look civilian and may have been civilian, but they were caught in areas where Hamas was fighting and the IDF was forced to fight there. Now, I'm not saying that the IDF is perfect and that we operate in a surgical environment. Anybody that has been through war or studied other wars knows that war, especially in urban terrain, especially against a non-state actor, a terrorist organization, it's messy, it's dynamic, mistakes are made. Sadly, and this again probably isn't reported so much in Western media, when you look at Israeli casualty numbers, it hurts me to say, but almost 20% of our own casualties are a result of what's called friendly fire. That goes to show how difficult the conditions are on the ground. Of course, Israeli soldiers don't intend to kill other Israeli soldiers, but the dynamic and ever-changing environment creates these situations. So people who are quick to blame Israel or blame the IDF for killing civilians and for damaging infrastructure, first and foremost should think about the question, why is the IDF there? The IDF is there because Israel was attacked on October the 7th and it has to defend Israeli civilians. And the only way of doing so is going in and taking out the infrastructure that supported Hamas and made it possible to attack Israel. And of course, Israel cannot allow such an event to happen again. And as such, it has to go in and defend itself. That's one. And second, if Hamas would act like a military and would fight from bases and would fight from the open terrain or in areas where there are no civilians, I can assure you that the amount of civilian casualties and destruction would be absolutely minimal because the IDF wouldn't have any military objective. There wouldn't be any, in legal terms, military necessity to go and fight in areas where the enemy doesn't exist. Israel fights where the enemy is, and the enemy is hiding behind civilians, and the enemy is using the civilian infrastructure. And this is the unfortunate situation that so many people in their eagerness to criticize Israel overlook, perhaps not only eagerness, but perhaps when people are, guided by emotions and perhaps very much influenced by sad images on social media, when you see sad pictures of children that are killed or women, and when you see destruction and rubble, this speaks to the gut, it speaks to feelings, and people are then very easily persuaded that everything that's happening is Israel's fault, when in fact it isn't.
And also, there's so many questions I have about that, but I want to ask a specific question also. Isn't it true that Israel actually offered Hamas at the after the 7th of October a deal where there doesn't need to be any war or bombing if you fulfill these two criteria? One, drop all your weapons and surrender and release the hostages, and there will be no war. Is that true?
Yes, and it's been made more than once. It's been said more than once. Of course, when Israel says it, Israel knows that Hamas won't do it, because if they'd had any intentions of sparing life and preventing destruction in Gaza, they wouldn't have planned or executed the atrocities of October the 7th. Hamas knew. They knew very well that once they go into Israel and they kill as many Israelis as they did and they take hostages, it wasn't going to end well for the Gaza Strip, for the people who live there, or for Hamas. But Hamas say, we are willing. They said specifically, we need this blood to infuse our revolutionary spirit. Those are words of senior Hamas leaders. They wanted the killing. They wanted the blood in order to keep their so-called struggle going. What's their struggle? Many people don't speak about it, and they say, oh yeah, Hamas, maybe they're not so nice. Some people use the word terrorist, some don't use the word terrorist, but Hamas is a very, very dark and evil organization. Their goal is to annihilate the state of Israel. If anybody in this conflict has a goal to do genocide, Hamas wants to do genocide. Hamas openly says, they say it in Arabic, they say it in their charter, they say it in interviews after October the 7th and before October the 7th. Our goal is to establish a Sharia-based country in the wake of what used to be Israel, what they call the Zionist entity, and everybody that lives there will be under our rule, and if they are Muslims, they can live. If they are Jews, they cannot. That's the political vision for the future of Hamas. So we have to listen to that. People have to understand that when you deal with an organization, by the way, if you compare Hamas and their founding documents and charter, and you compare that to ISIS, the regional perspective is different. ISIS spoke about the region and the world. The caliphate should be a global thing, but first and foremost formed in the Middle East and eradicate old colonial borders. But the idea is the same. Hamas speaks about Palestine, they speak about the entire world. But when you look at the type of governments, the type of society that they want, not too many differences. Sharia law, zero tolerance for everything that isn't under Sharia law. And those that are non-Muslims have a choice, convert or live as a second-grade citizens, pay a specific tax, goes back to Quranic times. There's a reference to it, and you can pay a tax, and if you are loyal and okay, and you do as we say, then you can live. If not, we kill you.
Do you think Hamas wants to destroy Israel for geographic purposes, like they want the land, they want to live there? Is it political purposes like that, or is it because of Jew hatred itself, like anti-Semitism in its essence, like they want to kill all Jews? Like which, or is it both, or which one of those are most important? Is like land areas or the people?
I would say that it's more about a religious vision of conquering what they call Palestine, the land of Israel, and governing it. It's part of the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the ideological roots of Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood. And as I said, it's similar to what ISIS, which is an extreme, violent interpretation of Muslim Brotherhood philosophy. Muslim Brotherhood basically says we will create a society based on Islamic rule, on Sharia law. Basically, Muslim Brotherhood, and I'm paraphrasing and generalizing a bit, but basically what Muslim Brotherhood says, we will build it from the bottom up, through society, through institutions, through mosques, through charities, and through civil organizations, and then we will bring that into statehood, and then that will be the state. That's why Arab regimes, the Egyptians, the Iraqis, the Saudis, the Syrians, etc., are so fearful of the Muslim Brotherhood because it challenges the model of the modern state, of the more or less secular state, where the authority is the government and not religious people and clerics and people who believe that they have decrees from a divine entity. What's different with Hamas is that they say, yeah, this is the aim, but the way to get there is jihad. It's armed struggle. And they claim that they are on the path of mukawama, of resistance, and that they will achieve that goal not just by building a new society, institutions, mosques, schools, education, civil society, etc., but they will do that and armed struggle, jihad. So I think that what's guiding Hamas is a burning religious conviction that they should take the land of Israel by force, and they should implement Sharia law and govern it. I don't know how much anti-Semitism. I mean, I think, okay, would Hamas go on, expeditionary missions to the US and Europe in order to find Jews and kill them? I'm not sure. I think that it is more geographically confined, and I think it is focused, based in religion, focused on territory, and with a strategy of building a Sharia-based political entity, again, similar to ISIS. I think that their hatred is more focused on Israelis, even though, by the way, when they speak about Israel, they don't say the Israelis. They always speak about Jews. Kill the Jews, and they don't say Israel. They say the Zionist entity. They don't even recognize that we exist as a state. But usually when you look at their propaganda and when you look at what they teach in schools, by the way, also what many of the Palestinian schools in the PA, Palestinian Authority, when they teach their kids, many UNRWA schools there, it's about the Jews in general. Not a very strong distinction between Jews and Israelis. This is reflected in Palestinian textbooks. I know that you've spoken with Palestinian Media Watch and others who are experts in this. And it's an interesting distinction, because you would think that, well, they don't hate all the Jews, but maybe they only have a problem with the Jews who are independent and have a country. I don't know. But bottom line, what I think that Hamas are religious extremists that are motivated by some vision of a Sharia-based country, and that it's focused on what they call Palestine, what I call the land of Israel, our ancestral homeland, where there is absolutely no reference, no historical basis, no archaeological basis, and no literary basis for any of the claims that Hamas makes.
Also, how much support do you think, and also if we have any data on this, how much support does Hamas have in the civil or civilian society in Gaza? Is it like a lot of support? Do people actually cheer for them and root for them and think that they're doing a good job and agree to the 7th of October? And do we have any data on this? Do we know this?
Yeah, so I mean, first we have to acknowledge that it is a autocratic society. It's a repressive regime. Hamas governs by violence and by force, by repression, by intimidation, by terror. It's a regime. The last elections, the only elections that were held in Gaza were in 2006. Hamas came to power, consolidated power, and then started very quickly to abolish any political opposition that existed. And since then, there has been absolutely no freedom, no elections, no civil rights, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of opinion and expression. By the way, it's odd when you look at European countries who allegedly care about this. When you look at countries like Norway, Scandinavia, Canada, the US, Western Europe, who are champions of democracy, who are democracies who uphold democratic values, and you hardly ever hear them speak about how important it is for Palestinians to have democracy. You hear them criticize Israeli democracy a lot, and you hear them voice opinions of the state of Israeli democracy, but you never hear them really speak about the fact that the last elections in Gaza were 2006, and the last elections in the Palestinian Authority were, I think, 19 years ago. And that's okay. But when you look at, regarding the question, so I think we have to look at it's difficult to have good data from Gaza because it is a oppressive society. There have been polls, and I'd recommend people going in and looking online at Dr. Shikaki. He is a Palestinian pollster. He's a bit of a propagandist as well. He does some Palestinian propaganda by the way that he asks questions, and you can see that he has a narrative about Palestinian statehood, and he wants to promote that, and you can see it in the questions. But nevertheless, the polls are interesting. And he does polls of Palestinians in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria, the PA-controlled areas, what some people refer to as the West Bank. And it's interesting to see the level of support that Hamas enjoys, what it enjoyed before the war, and also what it enjoys after October the 7th, both in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. And short story, Hamas has a lot of support. If elections were held today, free elections were held today in Judea and Samaria, the PA areas, Hamas would win by a landslide. And if elections were held today in Gaza, it would be closer, but Hamas would stand a good chance of winning. And that's after October the 7th. That's after the tremendous destruction that has befallen Gaza as a result of Hamas's actions. And people still have a lot of support for Hamas. Now, we have to be careful when we form our opinions of what we see in social media. When we see videos, for instance, of Israeli hostages that were dragged over into Gaza on the back of pickup trucks or on motorcycles, and you see masses, hundreds, if not thousands of people gathering around, cheering, filming, screaming Allahu Akbar in a fervor of hatred and excitement, it looks authentic. It looks as if this is a spontaneous show of support and joy by people when Hamas took Israeli hostages and paraded them through the streets of Gaza. They drove for miles and miles, and people were cheering, and everyone were going in and beating and hitting and spitting and part of the whole thing. And it looked as if they were really, really happy about what Hamas did. When you also look at numbers of how many ordinary Palestinians participated on October the 7th and went into Israel after the first wave of Hamas stormtroopers went in and massacred and raped and killed and mutilated and beheaded and burned, etc., and abducted, the breach was still open, and there were still openings through the fence, and ordinary Palestinians went in to kill, rape, loot, steal, and to do other horrible things, which again would indicate that there's a very strong grassroots level support. There's hatred, first and foremost, and then there's also support of Hamas activities. I say that we should be careful because there may be people in Gaza whose voice isn't heard who have different views. There may be, and I think we should have at least a small part of uncertainty in our heads that this may be the case. And if we want to be hopeful for the future, then we should try to make that piece of Gazan society larger and try to build the future together with them. So far, judging from what I've seen on Arabic news channels and on social media, and I monitor Gazan social media, that is not the picture. The picture is one of tremendous support by Palestinians of Hamas's atrocities, of identifying with what they did on October the 7th, killing, abducting, raping, etc., and of supporting Hamas's activities in fighting against Israel. But I think it's important that we at least hope and then actively try to find and enhance the parts of Gazan society that, because they're living under a repressive regime, have not been able to show their more positive sides, which are inclined to reconcile and perhaps live in coexistence with Israelis. I believe that they exist, and I believe that once Hamas will be defeated clearly by Israel, and once all Gazans would understand that the path of Muqawama, that the jihad has lost, and the path of Muqawama leads to destruction, leads to failure, more and more people will say, okay, that's wrong. Now what can we do in order to have a better future? And if we want a better future, let's start working instead of spending time buying weapons and preparing for war against Israel. Let's build our infrastructure. Let's educate our children. Let's think about peace. And most importantly, let's come to the terms and accept that those guys on the other side, the Jews that they call us, the Israelis, they're here to stay. This is their homeland, and they're not going anywhere. And the sooner that Gazans will understand it, the better it will be for Gazans.
As an extension to that question, as a soldier on the ground, if like a civilian who you believe is a civilian start acting in the way such as the terrorist from Hamas, like on October 7th that you mentioned, when the ports were open, the gates were open, they were rushing in, doing the same thing. Like as a soldier, like with rules of engagement, everything, does that person then convert from being regarded as a civilian to being an enemy combatant?
Yes.
You do, yeah.
Yeah. Because in the laws of armed conflict and in rules of engagement, and this is pretty universal to all nation-state militaries who act according to the laws of armed conflict, you judge by capabilities and intentions. So someone can look civilian. Let's say someone is dressed in traditional Arabic dress, female Arabic dress, which conceals most of the body, so you don't know what's underneath the dress. So what you see with the naked eye is someone who looks like a civilian woman. But if then that woman acts in a way that poses a threat to troops or to civilians, then in a very quick moment, she becomes from an ordinary civilian who is not to be targeted to something that is a threat. And then there's different levels of force that is used in order to stop that threat from materializing. And usually you start with the least amount of power. So if it's a situation where you have enough time to mitigate the threat without killing the person, because you don't know for certain that it is an enemy combatant, it may be someone who was confused or got crazy or is under pressure. Things happen. So you use the least amount of power that you can in order to stop the threat. What does that mean in practical terms? Warning shots. And if warning shots don't work, you fire towards the legs. So in that way, after warning shots are fired, if you have time to do that, then you at least stop the threat. And then if it's a civilian, can be treated and it's probably not a mortal situation. And if it's a threat, then the threat has been neutralized. But of course, based on the situation on the ground, soldiers and officers have to make split-second decisions of life and death, of their own lives, their lives of their friends, affecting lives of others, according to the guidance that they have. Most of the time they get it right. Most of the time they do very, very good decisions. Sometimes there are also mistakes made. They're tragic, but they are unfortunately part of the fighting. But the rules of engagement are there in place to give tools to soldiers and officers in a very chaotic environment, where what makes it so difficult is that the enemy constantly exploits the reality on the ground and exploits civilians and exploits and abuses the protected sites like schools, hospitals, mosques, UN facilities, etc., and constantly hides as a civilian. And what soldiers have to do is that they constantly scan around them. Everything is a threat. And it gets, temporarily checked for not being a threat if it's monitored and if it doesn't behave like a threat. But if you see weapons or abnormal behavior, it's a threat, even if it is dressed as a civilian. And again, this isn't unique Israeli thinking. This is how American soldiers deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria think. This is how British troops deployed in Afghanistan would operate. And this is how Swedish troops deployed in peacekeeping in Mali would look at what's happening and immediately classify, is this a threat or isn't, according to the information available.
And what do you think about the death toll numbers? First of all, It seems like all the media, especially Norwegian media, but Western media also, is just accepting the death toll numbers that they get from Palestinian authorities as truth and evidence, like this is 100% true, and just using them as evidence for the situation on the ground. What do you think about that in itself? And do you think that the death toll numbers that they present are real in some way? And how could they be able to count the amount of people dead so fast? Like an example of that is the hospital that was hit by a rocket in the early days of the war, where everybody was blaming Israel, of course, at first.
Yeah.
And then they said, 500 people have died or something like that. And then they found out, sorry, it was our own rockets. And then they reduced the death toll numbers by a factor of 10 or so, because it was their own rocket. So how can Western media be so accepting of the numbers that the Palestinian authorities are bringing forth?
Yeah, this is a super important topic because these numbers shape policy and they serve as an excuse to criticize Israel and to punish Israel by the West. First and foremost, I'd say that professionally, many journalists and editors and the editors of the editors in London, New York, Paris, Berlin, Stockholm, and many other places, they're not doing their job. They're lazy, or worse than that, in not applying the same journalistic standards of scrutiny and skepticism when it comes to information provided by Palestinians that they do when it is information provided by Israel. One would think that it would be the opposite thing. One side is presented is a terrorist organization that is oppressive, undemocratic, rules by force, and abducts civilians and happily executes civilians and fires rockets at civilians. That's Hamas. The other side is a democratic country defending itself against aggression from a terrorist organization. One would think, of course, one would be naive, but one would think that the democratic country, the nation state, would have the more automatic support. If anybody would get any breaks by the government, then I think by the media, then I think that a democracy fighting for itself should get that. That isn't the case, and we actually see a perverse situation where information provided by Hamas, a party to the conflict, is parroted, unchecked, and unverified by most international media, and is turned from lies presented by Hamas to actual facts that Western decision makers use in order to make decisions. That number, by the way, is moving, and we're now the 11th of May. Very interesting to follow, to check out Twitter accounts like a guy named Eisenberg, and also the FDD, where I work, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, been looking into the numbers and really crunching the numbers and analyzing the numbers produced by Hamas, which is the health ministry, the Gazan health ministry. They've presented numbers that they have then given to UN institutions in Gaza, specifically the High Commissioner for Human Rights and also for refugees, OCHA. And then what the established practice was that Hamas would present numbers. 10 minutes after, those numbers would be on a UN website with the UN stamp on it. And then journalists and others would say, well, if the UN is reporting, then of course it's true. This has been verified. There's a UN symbol on it, so we can report it. And of course, it fits with the narrative. It's the bad Israelis. They're killing civilians without caring about it. These monstrous Israelis. So it fits with underlying bias, it fits with lazy journalism, and it fits with supporting Hamas, and then it gets represented. The problem is that it's full of lies. And now if you go into the website of OCHA, and if you look at numbers that are presented, you see that they're actually revisiting the numbers and dramatically reducing the number of killed women, killed children, and killed elderly, which are the three most sensitive categories of people that definitely are not supposed to die in war. And if they die, it's sad. And Israel does a lot in order to minimize the killing of these groups. And you see that in some of these brackets, there's a 50% decrease. In the past, they claimed that there was X amount of women killed, then they halved it. Because they're under pressure, because other people are looking at it and saying, well, this doesn't make sense. Your numbers do not add up. It doesn't make sense. And of course, they are not honest enough and truthful enough to actually come out and say, mea culpa, we have been misleading the public, misleading the world, misleading the humanitarian organizations, misleading decision makers, because we relied on Hamas figures and we presented them with legitimacy of our emblem, which is what I think they should do. They should be held accountable. The people who made those decisions, which probably are Gazans, local staff working for UN organizations in Gaza, and then their bosses, Western bosses who live somewhere out of Gaza, they should be held accountable. Why did you use Hamas information and present it as truth? And I think it's very sad and unfortunate because it serves Hamas's propaganda purposes. It focuses attention on suffering in Gaza, but it blames Israel instead of blaming Hamas, who really is responsible for what's happening and really is the aggressor here, and the ones that, as I said before, is using civilians as their human shields, using them in order to defend itself. So there are many wrongs in it. The only thing that I wish Israel had done differently would have been to engage and to hold institutions and media outlets accountable by providing its own number. So yes, I think I can expect big Western mainstream media to do its job and check the numbers, and if it doesn't add up and if it looks odd, then be careful and suspicious and don't just print it, which mostly by and large they have not done. They've just printed it. And I should expect them as a media consumer to do their job and to apply journalistic standards. And in addition to that, I think Israel should have had its number based on research, based on intelligence, based on Israeli assessment, and also based on looking what Hamas is saying and then verifying or fact-checking the numbers that Hamas put out. Sadly, that hasn't been done, should have been done. And had Israel done it, then I think there would have been a better ability to undermine the lies that Hamas has been spreading, that many people, organizations, and media have been parroting around the world.
Why do you think they're parroting it? Like the UN and the media, why are they so lazy? Is it intentional? Is this because of Israel hate and anti-Semitism? Like they wouldn't be that lazy with any other situation or country. Then they would. I would assume it's like so obvious that they're being lazy, almost intentionally. It seems to me.
One could definitely think that. I tried to find other conflicts where one side was systematically shown in a negative light by Western media. Maybe if you look at Russia, but even then, when the Russians provide information, etc., it's given a lot of credibility by Western media. So I cannot think of any other democracy defending itself with a sovereign army that gets that kind of treatment. And we can speculate as to why. We can speculate as to why. Is it just laziness? Is it hatred of Israel disguised as laziness, or is it an oversight? Is it a mistake? If it happened once or twice, you could think that it was laziness or workload or a mistake or an oversight. But since it seems institutional, then I think we should ask really questions of why. Why is it so? And also, why isn't the fact that the UN has started to revise its numbers of casualties downwards, not adding casualties, but actually that there are less casualties, why isn't that a story? Why isn't that reported? Why aren't UN officials held accountable? Why don't they summon the head of OCHA and the head of UNRWA and the head of the Commissioner for Human Rights? Why aren't they summoned and held to task by journalists? Why aren't the journalists angry, saying, hey, you misled us? We poor journalists, we just have millions of dollars for fact-checking and special investigation teams. We didn't know that you were lying to us. Why isn't that being said?
What do you think about UN right now? Do you think that they have been compromised? Do you think that they are credible anymore? What is your opinion on the UN now?
You know, I spent a few good years of my life working with UN peacekeeping forces. I was a liaison officer on behalf of the IDF to UN peacekeeping in Lebanon and on the Golan Heights. I was the first Israeli officer to be seconded to the UN. So I was loaned from Israel and worked at the UN in New York headquarters. Very interesting. And, you know, I was raised in Sweden. And in Sweden, people really love international institutions. People really like the UN and other big humanitarian organizations, and they really believe in them. And I think a part of me still wants to believe that they could do good. I think that's the part of my Swedish upbringing. But when the more realistic and experienced part of me looks at the situation today, I'm very sad for the state of the UN. I am very sad for the state of many of its funds and programs and institutions that in general, I would say, have been hijacked by radical ideologies that are not serving the values of the UN Charter, that are not serving democratic human values, not serving the rule of law, not serving the protection of women, minorities, freedom of speech, and basic human dignity. And you find that UN programs and institutions are in cahoots with or in bed with some of the worst regimes in the world and actually supporting them. One example is UNRWA. The UN Relief and Works Agency, active throughout the entire Middle East, but very important in Gaza, is in my mind really an abomination. And I say that strong word and I stand by it because I think it is a structural evil that exists in the Middle East, and it does nothing good but to extend suffering, prolong the conflict, keep the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians alive, and does nothing good to promote peace or stability or reconciliation. And the sooner that UNRWA is gone, the better for Palestinians and the better for the region and the better for Israel. And what we've seen throughout this conflict, I think, it goes along the same trend of UN organizations failing their charter, failing to implement their mandate, and failing humanity on all sides. And it's UN peacekeeping in Lebanon, and it's UN institutions in Gaza. UN peacekeeping, a 10,000-strong man mission exists in southern Lebanon called UNIFIL, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon. They have a budget of around $530 million per year. Many countries provide a lot of the money. There are more than 48 or 49 countries participating as per their website. And they claim that they do 450 activities every day. Patrols, overflights, interactions with the Lebanese, etc., etc. None of the 3,000 rockets, drones, and missiles that Hezbollah and other terrorists in Lebanon have fired at Israel from within southern Lebanon, the area where UNIFIL is present and is supposed to uphold the mandate, none of those attacks have been prevented. And almost 30 Israelis have been killed by incoming rockets and drones and missiles fired from Lebanon into Israel. All of those are violations. And the exact reason why UNIFIL was built and was sustained for so many years is to prevent that. Since 2006, their new mandate was basically, let's prevent the Second Lebanon War from happening again. But UNIFIL hasn't achieved that. And it's a tremendous failure. It's a failure. It's a sad, magnificent failure. Now we are, at the cusp of war with a large-scale war with Hezbollah, because the tool that the international community used, the peacekeeping force, has failed. And southern Lebanon is governed by Hezbollah. They're using it to fire at Israel. They have pushed 100,000 Israelis out of their homes in northern Israel, and they say that they will continue to fire with an open check, and until they want to stop firing. Nobody's stopping them. So that's one failure. UNRWA is not only a failure, but a cancer in Gaza, part of the problem, not part of the solution. And when I look at, the UN as an organization, peacekeeping, UN programs, I'm sad to say, but I see a corrupt organization. I see an organization that has a great charter, which came into effect after the biggest atrocity in modern human history, the Holocaust and the Second World War. I think much of the inspiration and the need to have the UN was as a result of the atrocities of the Second World War, and specifically the Holocaust. And today, when you look at it, it's a forum that has been hijacked by non-democratic countries. They hold majority. Look at the votes, the recent votes just 2 days ago or 3 days ago to have a so-called Palestinian state. It goes along the lines of democracies and non-democracies. All of the non-democracies of the world, bar none, they voted to bring a Palestinian state. Democracies, the brave ones, they voted against, and the lesser brave ones, they abstained. Would have been nice if democracies had voted for the democracy, but sadly that isn't the case. And you see that it's become such a joke when, and I'm deviating a bit here, but when Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, holds chair of the Human Rights Commission, the rotating chair, then it sounds like the beginning of a very bad joke. When China, a repressive, autocratic regime that has absolutely no respect for human rights, has such influence on UN programs, on key personnel, on funds, and on key committees, then really what's the point? If it doesn't serve the purposes of humanity, of human rights, of liberty, of protecting the weak in societies and protecting the weaker, then what's the use of having it if it doesn't do its job? And sadly, from an Israeli perspective, the UN doesn't do any good. It actually is different levels of negative, different levels of bad. And that's something that I think urgently needs to be fixed by the UN. There needs to be democratic, powerful countries with veto power in the Security Council to say the UN needs tremendous reform, because the world needs a UN. The world needs a World Food Program and a World Health Program, and it needs a commissioner for refugees, and it needs a commissioner for human rights. These are things that are needed because there are many things happening in the world, but there's such a fixation and bias in the UN, and I speak from personal knowledge, not only things read in the media, against Israel, that it's like a cancer eating away at UN institutions, and equally bad, it's eroding the trust that other good, sane people have in this organization, because they see that it's a joke, it's a clown show, it's a bad one against Israel and against other democracies. So I think that on a large scale here, this is a strategic threat for the UN. The way that they are failing, the way that the UN is failing its charter, the way that UN peacekeeping has failed in Lebanon, and the way that UN organizations have been the front for a Hamas regime in Gaza, these are all tied together, and it really, there should be a big call here for a extensive overhaul. When you renovate the house, you either tear it down or you do a gut renovation. Let's say a gut renovation of the UN where you lay everything bare and correct things, build new things, and really make it into something that serves humanity. But yes, unequivocally says we promote democracy. We favor democracy. We favor human rights. We don't favor dark, medieval types of governance. We do not favor a jihadi perspective on life. We do not favor autocratic regimes. That isn't what the UN was founded for, to be a vehicle for these regimes to have power and influence over democracies.
Jonathan, I thank you so much for your time. You're a busy man. We have to finish up now. One final question. Will Israel survive?
Not only will Israel... First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. And yes, we could go on and on. Maybe we'll save it for the next episode. Maybe in Israel.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, we could have it out in the nature, perhaps overlooking the border. You know what? Let's aim to do maybe a next podcast in a rebuilt kibbutz around Gaza, where we can see and witness Israel's victory and the victory of the region.
Yes.
Israel's victory against Hamas, the victory that will be shown by Israeli kids playing safely in their homes.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll be able to do it with a rebuilt Gaza that is no longer focused on killing Israelis and Jews, but on caring for their own future. So to answer your question, yes, Israel will not only survive, Israel will survive and it will prosper. The people of Israel are in their home, in the land of Israel, our ancestral home, our home where we have every right to belong, and where we have every right and intention to continue to exist and prosper. The land of Israel is prosperous and blooming and growing thanks to the fact that the people of Israel own it. And many things you can say about the Zionist endeavor, the Zionist enterprise. It's very difficult to argue with the level of success and prosperity that the return of the people of Israel have brought to the land of Israel. Nobody else did it before because it wasn't theirs. There were empires that came and went and foreigners who ruled by the power of the sword. That isn't the story of Israel. So even though we are in a dark hour, lots of enemies around us, the Iranian, all of it almost led by and coordinated by Iran. Despite that being the case, despite the difficult situation in Gaza, a fierce and brutal enemy, Hezbollah in the north, and other challenges that we don't have the time to go into. Yes, I am hopeful, and I, for one, will continue to live in Israel, work in Israel, pay a lot of taxes in Israel to support the country, and to educate my kids to be proud Zionists, proud Israelis, to stand up for what's right, for their homeland and their country, to be respectful of others and their feelings and aspirations, but not to confuse respecting others with trampling over us. And yes, Israel will continue to be strong and prosper and grow, and we shall overcome this difficult moment as well.
Am Israel Chai.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.